It started with smoke, not from my chimney, not from a neighbor's grill, but from the blackened remains of the house I had built with my own hands, rising into the dawn air like a cruel joke. And as I stood at the edge of my property with the fire marshal shaking his head, the acrid stench of scorched wood and melted memories wrapping around me like a shroud, I knew two things immediately. One, this was no accident, and two, the HOA finally belling, finally belling Rowan Kuttering, HOA finally belling Omar Miai, belly pump, been circling me like vultures, insisting that my refusal to join their association made me some kind of outlaw, some kind of parasite benefiting from their neighborhood without paying dues, ignoring the fact that my land had been privately held long before their gated community sprouted up like weeds around it, ignoring the fact that my title deed, recorded in the county office, proved I had no obligation to their petty rules or fines, and refining and codifying property law itself as one of the state's leading legislative writers, so if anyone knew the limits of HOA authority, it was me, and that knowledge was the very thing Karen, their iron-fisted president, hated most about me. She had tried everything before the fire. Mailed threats disguised as invoices, uniformed lackeys banging on my door with citations, even calling the police once to accuse me of trespassing on my own front porch, only for the responding officer to laugh when I pulled out my original property surveys and explained I had literally helped draft the statutes governing unlawful entry and association overreach, but the HOA was not used to revere the stat used to revere. Their bluster failed. Karen's smile grew tighter, her tone sharper, until finally, on a cold night, while I was out attending a late session at the courthouse, they sent someone, or more likely a group, to finish the job by torching my home, hoping that destruction would succeed where intimidation had failed. But here's the thing about writing laws. You know how to turn tragedy into a noose for the guilty. And as I sifted through the ashes with gloved hands, pulling out charred fragments of books, twisted metal from my grandfather's tools, and the blackened stone that had once been my hearth, I wasn't grieving in helplessness. I was calculating, piecing together not just what I'd lost, but the chain of evidence, motive, and authority that would hang Karen. The fire marshal confirmed accelerants had been used, that it was arson, and though the HOA members thought they were clever by hiding behind a cloak of collective decision-making, what they had actually done was leave a trail of minutes, signatures, and votes authorizing action against me. Because these people loved their paperwork, loved to feel official, loved to document their tyranny, and those very documents, once subpoenaed, would be because buried documents, once subpoenaed, would subpoenaed, would because of free she. I didn't say much at first, didn't confront anyone, didn't even file a civil suit, because patience is a lawyer's sharpest blade. Instead, I quietly moved into a small rental nearby, began reconstructing timelines, calling in favors from colleagues at the Attorney General's office, and gathering every shred of record that proved not only their harassment but their escalation. And when the whispers began, neighbors asking if I would finally neighbors asking if I would finally neighbors asking if I would finally and when the whispers began, neighbors asking if I would finally their office. Gone. I only smiled because what they didn't know, what Karen didn't know, was that the man they tried to crush was the very man who had written the statutes that would determine their fate, and the law, once unleashed, is merciless to those who believe themselves above it. The thing about building a case isn't always about collecting the obvious evidence. It's about creating a net so tight that even the smallest fish can't wriggle free. And as I settled into my temporary rental overlooking the ruins of my home, I began methodically laying out my plan like a chessboard, knowing full well Karen and her HOA had overplayed their hand when they set my house ablaze. Because arson isn't just a civil matter, it's a felony. And arson isn't just a civil matter, it's a felony. And fiend. Intent, it climbs to the level of racketeering, something I'd personally helped codify into state law to combat organized property fraud, and suddenly, every smug letter, every citation they had left on my door, every HOA meeting note that referenced me by name transformed from petty harassment into evidence of a criminal conspiracy. But I didn't rush because I knew Karen's kind. The power-drunk dictator hiding behind Presigia, hiding behind Presigia, hiding behind Presigia, feigned Presigia, believed she'd won. And sure enough, within days of the fire, she couldn't help herself, standing at the community center podium during an HOA meeting and practically bragging to the crowd about how certain elements had been removed for the betterment of our neighborhood. Her words recorded by a neighbor with a cell phone who sent me the clip that same night. And as I replayed it, listening to the smug applause that followed, I felt no anger. I felt no anger. Coupled with the fire marshal's report, was enough to light the fuse on a legal avalanche. Still, I wanted more, so I began requesting official HOA meeting minutes through a quiet motion filed with the county records office, because many HOAs, foolishly, file their decisions publicly to appear transparent. And sure enough, the paper trail was waiting for me, a neat set of documents signed by Karen herself, authorizing corrective action against non-compliant landowners who refuse membership. And though they had used vague fuse membership, and though they had used vague fuse membership, and though they had used vague of their action, which made the link undeniable. As the net tightened, I brought in allies. First a colleague from the state fire marshal's office who owed me a favor, then a prosecutor who had once been my intern and now worked as an assistant district attorney, and slowly, without fanfare, we began assembling charges: arson, conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of private property, harassment, and under the statutes I had once drafted, a potential RICO case for using an orgeoic. While this was happening, Karen grew bold, strutting around the neighborhood as though she were queen of a conquered land, even sending me a notice printed on official HOA letterhead demanding that I vacate the ashes of my former residence as they were an eyesore in violation of community standards, and I nearly laughed myself hoarse reading it because she had just handed me the final nail for her coffin. Proof that not only did she use it as a lever to force me out. I let her think I was cornered, never responding, never confronting, while behind the scenes my legal machine roared to life, drafting injunctions, motions, and discovery requests that would soon crash down on her HOA like a tidal wave. But what Karen didn't anticipate, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that my influence went beyond the courtroom, because years of working at the state capitol had left me with a Rolodex of allies in government, representatives, senators, regulators, who all owed me favors. And when I quietly began making phone calls, explaining that a rogue HOA had burned my house down in an attempt to force compliance, the outrage was Emmy. Helped write the property statutes. It could happen to anyone, and politicians know nothing motivates faster than a scandal that makes voters angry. Within weeks, a legislative committee announced it would be reviewing HOA powers statewide, and suddenly Karen's smug smile faltered, her iron grip on the neighborhood showing cracks, as residents realized their precious property values were at risk, not from me, but from her recklessness, and whispers began to circulate that perhaps she had gone too far. I heard about these whispers from the same neighbors who once shunned me, now nervously asking if I planned to press charges, if I would go easy on the community, if there was still a way to make peace. But I only smiled and said little because by then the trap was already sprung and the subpoenas were on their way, demanding all HOA records, communications, emails, and financial statements, which, when reviewed, revealed something even net action against me, but they had used community funds, homeowner dues, to pay the arsonist they had hired, a man whose name appeared in a contractor's ledger as receiving emergency maintenance disbursements right around the time of the fire. And when investigators dug deeper, that man turned out to have a prior record for arson for hire, which meant Karen and her board had left a paper trail directly to their crime. By the time the warrants were issued, by the time uniformed officers marched up to the HOA office and began hauling out boxes of files, laptops, and hard drives, Karen's empire was already collapsing. But I wasn't finished, because while criminal charges would punish them personally, I wanted the HOA itself dismantled, dissolved, its charter revoked, and its assets liquidated to pay restitution, not just to me, but to every home, but to every home, but to every home, but to every home, but to every home of terror. And with my legal knowledge, I knew exactly how to make it happen. The look on her face the morning the sheriff's deputies arrived. Courtrooms have a way of stripping away illusions, and when Karen was marched into hers in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, her once imperious presence evaporated under the fluorescent lights. But true to form, she tried to cling to her delusion of control, barking at her public defender that she demanded to speak directly to the judge, insisting that she had acted within her authority as president of the HOA. As president of the HOA, as Runsin, some kind of administrative citation. But the moment the prosecution began laying out its case, the illusion shattered because the evidence was overwhelming. Fire marshal reports indicating accelerants had been used, contractor logs showing HOA funds funneled to a known arsonist, recordings of Karen boasting in HOA meetings about removing obstacles to community compliance, and the damning letter she herself had signed demanding and the damning letter she herself had signed demanding the damning letter she herself had signed demanding Fire marshal reports indicating don't. Sat in the gallery watching her face twitch as each exhibit was introduced. Her neighbors, once her loyal followers, now shifting uneasily in their seats as they realized their dues money had funded not just petty fines but felony crimes. The trial became a spectacle, the media swarming like vultures, local news stations running headlines like HOA president charged with arson and power abuse scandal, while talk radio hosts raged about property rights and government overreach. And I couldn't have scripted it better because every newscast widened the spotlight on Karen and her cronies, and every headline made lawmakers more eager to distance themselves from the HOA system. She read jury. As the days dragged on, the defense tried to paint her as a victim, claiming rogue board members had acted without her knowledge. But the prosecutor, my former intern, now hardened and sharp as a blade, shredded that argument, producing HOA minutes with her signature approving corrective action, showing emails where she directed funds to the so-called contractor, and playing the recording where she practically confessed in front of an Closing arguments rolled around. It was clear Karen's fate was sealed. But I wasn't there merely for justice. I was there to dismantle the entire apparatus that had enabled her. And while the trial raged, I worked in the shadows on my parallel war, filing civil suits not just against Karen personally, but against the HOA corporation itself, against every board member who had voted for action, and even against the insurance company that had been complicit in covering HOA liabilities despite KKK. My strategy was simple: bleed them dry financially, dissolve their corporate charter through legal attrition, and redirect every penny back into restitution and rebuilding, because I wanted not just my house restored, but every victim of Karen's reign compensated, every fraudulent lien erased, every fine refunded, every bullied homeowner vindicated. At the same time, I pushed the legislative hearings forward, providing testimony that not only detailed my case, but highlighted how Karen's abuse wasn't an outlier. It was the inevitable result of unchecked HOA power. And as lawmakers listened to stories from other homeowners across the state who had suffered under petty tyrants, momentum built for sweeping reforms, limits on HOA authority, strict oversight, new transparency requirement, mandatory membership entirely. Watching Karen smirk fade as she realized her empire wasn't just collapsing, but being erased from the law books was the sweetest revenge, because she had imagined herself untouchable, the sovereign of her little fiefdom, and now her name was becoming synonymous statewide with corruption, arson, and abuse of power. When the verdict finally came, guilty on all counts with a recommendation for the maximum sentence, there was no cheer in the courtroom, only silence broken by Karen's shrill outburst as she was dragged away, screaming about ungrateful neighbors and biased judges. But by then, even her staunchest supporters were too ashamed to look at her. The real victory, however, came in the weeks that followed, when the civil suits I had filed began bearing fruit, the HOA's accounts frozen, their assets seized, their office shuttered under a court order, and soon after, the official announcement from the state that the HOA's charter had been revoked, its dissolution mandatory, its board permanently barred from serving any capacity of community governance. I stood outside the crumbling HOA office the day the sheriff's deputies taped the notice to the door, a small crowd of neighbors gathering behind me, people who once saw me as an enemy now whispering thanks, some in tears, realizing they were finally free from Karen's iron grip. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange peace wash over me. Yet, even then, I wasn't finished, because I knew Karen's downfall was just one story in a larger war, and the reforms I had sparked were still being drafted, debated, and pushed through the legislature. And I was determined to see them signed into law, not for my sake, but for every future homeowner who might otherwise suffer under another Karen. And so, while Karen rotted in a cell awaiting sentencing, while her HOA dissolved into dust, I prepared to take the fight to its final stage, ensuring that her crimes would leave a permanent scar, not just on her record, but on the laws of the land, a legacy she could never escape, one that would outlast her and protect countless others from ever facing the kind of nightmare she had unleashed upon me. Sentencing day came faster than anyone expected, though to Karen it must have felt like an eternity, because for someone who thrived on control, being confined in a holding cell with no authority, no followers, and no audience to applaud her outburst was a punishment in itself. But when she was brought into the courtroom this time, she no longer had that forced air of superiority, no longer sat with her nose in the air, pretending she was forced nose in the air, pretending she was nose in the air, pretending she was meals and nose in the air, pretending she was herself. Frazzled, her hair unkempt, her posture slumped, her eyes darting around the room for someone, anyone, to support her. Yet the gallery that had once been filled with HOA loyalists was now crowded with homeowners she had wronged, journalists eager for her downfall, and lawmakers quietly observing the spectacle as they prepared their own reforms. And I sat in the front row, arms crossed, not gloating, but resolute, because this wasn't Judge Joe, but resolute because this wasn't just Jay. Echoed across the state. The judge's words were slow, deliberate, each syllable a nail in the coffin of Karen's empire. Guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, abuse of authority, and aggravated arson, each charge carrying its own weight, stacking years upon years, until the total sentence stretched to decades, effectively ensuring Karen would never again walk freely through the community she once terrorized. And when the gavel fell, her knees buckled, her shriek couldn't stop herself from ranting about how this is a miscarriage of justice, and they'll regret silencing me. Yet her words only bounced off stone walls because no one believed her anymore. Not the jury, not her neighbors, not even the board members who once treated her like royalty, and as deputies escorted her away, she craned her neck in my direction, eyes blazing, as if I had personally orchestrated her ruin, which, in my face, she had lost, and she would never win again. But the sentencing was only one part of the justice machine grinding forward, because the civil litigation I had filed was now in full swing. And with Karen convicted, her HOA collapsed like a house of cards, the board members one by one resigning under the weight of subpoenas, their personal assets exposed, their reputation shredded, and the court-appointed receiver began liquidating what little the HOA had left in its coffers to pay ransom. Homeowner who had been fined, harassed, or financially strangled under Karen's rule, and I made sure no detail was overlooked. Every bogus violation, every lien, every unlawful foreclosure attempt was dragged into the light and reversed, refunds issued, debts erased, property titles restored, until the very people who once feared opening their mailboxes now celebrated the arrival of restitution checks. Simultaneously, I worked with state lawmakers to draft what became known as the Homeowner Bill of Rights, legislation that required every HOA in the state to submit to strict financial audits, forbade them from enacting punitive measures without judicial oversight, stripped them of the ability to levy unchecked fines, and most importantly, established an independent ombudsman's office to field complaints and enforce accountability, and I would implate committees, citing Karen's trial as the catalyst, offering legal language I had refined over years of watching HOA abuses play out in courtrooms, and when the governor finally signed the bill into law, the cameras caught the moment I stood behind him, a stack of documents in my hand, as he declared that no community should ever again be ruled by tyranny in the guise of governance. Meanwhile, Karen's name became a cautionary tale, plastered across news outlets and social media, HOA reform activists nationwide, seizing on her downfall as proof that the tide was turning, And the irony that she, once obsessed with power and prestige, had become the poster child for everything broken about the HOA system was not lost on anyone. But my personal victory was quieter. The rebuilding of my home, funded not just by restitution, but by the seized assets of the very people who tried to destroy me. And as contractors worked day by day to restore the cabin by the lake, I insisted on every beam, every nail being stronger, more fireproof, more enduring, not just to reclaim what I had lost, but to send a message that I could not be erased. When the final coat of paint dried, when the porch lights flickered on for the first time since the fire, I stood there with my dog at my side, breathing in the scent of fresh timber, the reflection of the lake shimmering under the moonlight. And I knew the house was more than shelter. It was a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of a war won. Yet still, I wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over, because I knew there would always be more Karens, more petty tyrants drawn to positions of small power like moths to a flame. And that was why I continued to push forward, not just in my own state, but across others, sharing my story, advising legislators, joining advocacy groups, and turning what began as a personal vendetta into a crusade for systemic change. The HOA system had burned down my house, but in return, I had lit a fire under lawmakers and citizens alike, a fire that would not die. And as for Karen, rotting behind bars, stripped of her crown, her empire dissolved, she could only watch from a cell as her legacy became a warning carved into law, her name invoked not in fear but in ridicule, a reminder of what happens when greed, arrogance, and unchecked power collide with had with sus. When the dust finally settled, when the last court filing was stamped and archived, when Karen was nothing more than a name whispered as a cautionary tale, I found myself standing on the deck of my rebuilt lake house staring out over the still waters, realizing that what had started as one woman's arrogance had ignited a war that ended up reshaping an entire system. And though it had been exhausting, mentally, emotionally, even physically, it had been exhausting, mentally, emotionally, even physically, I now. Because I had not only rebuilt my life, but had helped countless others who had been strangled by the same kind of tyranny that had consumed my neighborhood. And the ripple effects of Karen's downfall were still spreading further than even I had imagined. The lake itself, which she once tried to claim with her fines and threats, was now designated as a protected public resource thanks to new state legislation I had championed, meaning no HOA or private board could ever again try to monopolize or restrict access to the waterway. And every summer, families came here to fish, swim, kayak, and make memories without fear of some clipboard-wielding enforcer looming over them. And every time I saw those justice deeper than anything a courtroom could have given me. On top of that, the Homeowner Bill of Rights spread like wildfire. Neighboring states picked up the draft and passed similar laws. Grassroots movements used Karen's conviction as a rallying cry, and national news outlets ran investigative pieces exposing other abusive HOAs, which resulted in several high-profile resignations and criminal probes. Her name, ironically, became the trigger for the very reforms she would have despised most. And as in several high-profile resignations and criminal probes. And as a national news outlet she would have despised most. And as the truth was that her greed had handed me every tool I needed to dismantle her empire and prevent others from rising in its place. But the victory was not just systemic, it was personal too, because with restitution secured and my home rebuilt, I no longer lived under the shadow of fear or harassment, and when neighbors from the old subdivision came to visit, they confessed how liberating it felt to check their mailboxes without dread, to repaint their shutters without permission slips, to hold barbecues without threats of fines, and they thanked me, not with grand speech, porch, and genuine smiles. And that was when I understood that the war I had fought wasn't just mine. It belonged to every homeowner who had ever been bullied by people like Karen. Even more satisfying was knowing that Karen herself, stripped of her empire, sat in a prison uniform far from the lake she once tried to lord over, ranting to cellmates who didn't care about her HOA bylaws or her obsession with power, her letters to judges unanswered, her appeals dismissed, her voice silenced. And though I didn't revel in her suffering, I felt no sympathy either, because she had burned my house down without remorse, and they burned my house down without remorse, and they perdonate. I still remember the day I received the official notice. HOA dissolved, assets liquidated, accounts closed, stamped in red across the paperwork, and I pinned it on the wall of my study as a reminder of what persistence and law could achieve. Beside it hung a framed copy of the new legislation, signed into law, with my name listed among the drafters, and together those two documents told the entire story: a rise, a fall, and a rebirth. My evenings now were peaceful, spent sitting on the porch swing with my dog, the same one Karen once threatened to seize for violations, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold, sipping coffee and listening to the quiet hum of cicadas. And though scars remained, both on the land and within me, I wore them as badges of survival, proof that I could be broken down but not destroyed. Sometimes, visitors would ask me if I ever regretted not walking away, if the years of court battles, rebuilding, and endless meetings with lawmakers had been too heavy a price to pay. And I always answered the same, no, because if I had walked away, Karen would still be ruling with an iron fist, others would still be trapped in her web, and the system itself would still be unchecked. By standing my ground, I had not only avenged myself, but priceless. And so, the story of OA Karen didn't end with her victory, it ended with her destruction, with her empire in ashes, with laws rewritten in her wake, and with me, the man she thought she could crush with fines and fire, sitting stronger than ever in a home she could never touch again, knowing that the lake, the cabin, the land, and the peace that came with them were finally irrevocably mine.